The words, "Pay the bill, you broke old woman," echoed through Marcello's Italian restaurant loud enough that conversations at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence. Silverware froze halfway to mouths, and the piano player in the corner actually missed a note. My daughter-in-law Christine stood over me, her face flushed with anger and wine, jabbing her manicured finger toward the leather check presenter that lay between us on the white tablecloth. The bill was $347 for a dinner she'd insisted we attend to catch up after months of her avoiding my calls, and apparently she'd assumed I'd be paying for her filet mignon and 3 cocktails despite the fact that she'd spent the entire meal complaining about how I never helped them financially. The restaurant held maybe 60 people that Tuesday evening, and I'd estimate 58 of them were now staring at our table, watching a 32-year-old woman berate her 70-year-old mother-in-law in public. Christine didn't know several things in that moment: that I owned a company with 240 employees, that she was one of those employees listed as number 4,782 in our system, or that the company accountant she'd heard me mention casually was actually my personal CFO, who reported directly to me as founder and CEO. If you've ever been publicly humiliated by family who underestimated you, subscribe and tell me what state you're in, because what happened in the next 3 minutes would change Christine's life permanently. The check presenter sat on the table like a small leather bomb waiting to detonate our relationship, and I stared at it while Christine continued her performance for our unwilling audience. "I don't know why you're acting confused," she said, her voice carrying that particular pitch that suggests someone has rehearsed this confrontation. "You invited me to dinner. That means you pay. Or did you forget that too? Getting forgetful in your old age?" The insult about my age was deliberate, part of a pattern I'd noticed over the past year where Christine had started treating me like I was senile rather than simply 70. My son David had married her 4 years ago when she was 28 and working entry-level at what she thought was just another mid-sized marketing firm in downtown Seattle, never bothering to investigate that Summit Marketing Solutions was mine, that I'd built it from nothing in 1989, that the modest house I lived in and the simple clothes I wore were choices rather than limitations. I'd never corrected her assumption that I was a retired secretary living on Social Security, had never mentioned the $8 million company valuation, or the fact that I reviewed every employee's performance annually, including hers. The leather check presenter remained untouched between us, and I let the silence stretch while Christine's face grew redder, and the restaurant's attention became almost unbearable in its intensity. She'd made her choice to humiliate me publicly. Now I'd make mine about how to respond. My phone sat in my purse, a simple iPhone in a plain case that gave no indication it contained direct lines to my executive team, my attorneys, my accountants, and the HR director who handled all employee terminations. Christine was still talking. Something about how I never appreciated how hard she and David worked, how they were struggling to afford their mortgage on the 4-bedroom house in Bellevue that cost $8,000 monthly, how the least I could do was cover one dinner since I probably got some kind of senior discount anyway. The condescension dripped from every word, and I watched several nearby diners wince in sympathetic embarrassment for me. These strangers who assumed I was exactly what Christine claimed, a broke old woman being bullied by her daughter-in-law over a restaurant bill. The waiter had disappeared, probably hiding in the kitchen to avoid the confrontation, which meant our scene had an audience, but no referee. I reached slowly into my purse, pulled out my phone, and watched Christine's face shift to something like triumph, probably assuming I was calling David to ask him to cover the bill, to rescue me from her public shaming. Instead, I pulled up my contacts, scrolled to Richard Chen, CFO, and hit dial while maintaining eye contact with Christine across the table. The phone rang twice before Richard answered with his usual efficient greeting. "Evening, Ms. Patterson. What do you need?" His voice came through clearly enough that Christine probably heard it, heard the professional deference, heard him address me as Ms. Patterson rather than whatever diminutive she'd assumed people used for irrelevant old women. The shift in Christine's expression when she heard Richard's greeting was subtle but telling, a slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested she was recalculating something she'd been certain about moments before. "Richard, quick question," I said, keeping my voice level and clear enough that nearby tables could hear if they were still listening. which based on the continued silence, they definitely were. Can you pull up employee number 4782 and tell me their current salary? There was a pause, probably Richard accessing our HR system, and then his voice came back crisp and professional. Employee 4782 is Christine Morrison, Marketing Coordinator in the Digital Strategy Division. Current salary is $87,000 per year. Hired August 2019, last performance review rated satisfactory with notes about punctuality issues. Christine's face had gone from red to white, the color draining so fast I worried briefly about her blood pressure, and her mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. Wait, you work at Summit? The confusion in her voice was almost funny, the way she couldn't quite process that her broke old mother-in-law and the company owner she'd never met might be the same person. I'd been deliberately absent from the office for the past 3 years, working mostly from home after a minor stroke had made my doctor insist on reduced stress, which meant Christine had been hired, onboarded, and employed for 4 years without ever connecting the Patterson who signed her paychecks with the Patterson who'd married her father-in-law 46 years ago. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Everyone invested in this drama that had transformed from simple family dysfunction into something far more complex and satisfying for spectators who loved watching bullies realize they'd miscalculated. Richard was still on the line waiting for further instructions, and I could imagine him in his home office reviewing Christine's file with the careful attention he brought to any unexpected evening call from me. Richard, please note that effective immediately, Employee 4782's employment is terminated for cause. Gross insubordination and public disparagement of company leadership. Have HR prepare the paperwork tonight and email it to her personal address within the hour. She can return her laptop and access badge to security tomorrow morning, and her final paycheck should be processed according to standard termination procedures. I spoke clearly and calmly, making sure every word carried to Christine and to our audience, establishing that this wasn't a family squabble, but a business decision made by an employer who'd been publicly disrespected by an employee who'd made catastrophic assumptions. Richard confirmed he'd handle everything immediately, asked if there was anything else I needed, and disconnected after I thanked him and said we'd discuss details tomorrow. I set my phone down on the table next to the check presenter, pulled out my credit card, a Black American Express that definitely didn't come with senior discounts, and placed it deliberately on top of the bill. Christine remained frozen. Her earlier anger transformed into something like horror as she processed that she'd just been fired from her $87,000 job by the woman she'd been calling a broke old woman 60 seconds ago. The irony wasn't lost on our audience either, based on the whispers now rippling through nearby tables and the way the piano player had completely given up pretending to provide background music. I looked directly at Christine for the first time since pulling out my phone and said quietly, but clearly, "You're fired. Please leave." Christine's departure from Marcello's was not graceful or dignified, though to her minimal credit, she didn't make another scene, just grabbed her purse and coat and walked quickly toward the exit while carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone. The restaurant remained silent until the door closed behind her, and then the whispers erupted into actual conversations as people processed what they'd witnessed and probably started crafting the versions they'd tell friends tomorrow. The waiter materialized from wherever he'd been hiding, accepted my credit card with a sympathetic expression that suggested he'd seen the entire confrontation, and disappeared to process the payment while I sat alone at a table set for two, surrounded by the ruins of what had been an attempted reconciliation dinner. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Christine just called crying something about you firing her. What happened? Call me." The message was timestamped 4 minutes after I'd terminated his wife's employment, which meant she'd called him from her car before even leaving the parking lot, probably already crafting her version where she was the victim. I'd call David eventually, would explain calmly what his wife had done and why it had resulted in immediate termination, but not tonight. Not while I was still processing my own anger at having been publicly humiliated by someone who'd benefited from my company's payroll for 4 years while treating me like irrelevant poverty. The waiter returned with my receipt, and I added a 40% tip because he'd had to witness family dysfunction and deserved compensation. then gathered my belongings and walked out of Marcello's with my head high and my dignity intact, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who'd witnessed what happened when you underestimated old women who owned companies. The drive home took 23 minutes through Seattle's Tuesday evening traffic, and I spent most of it replaying Christine's face when she'd realized I wasn't a broke old woman, but her actual employer, the moment her triumph had curdled into horror. My house sat in a quiet neighborhood in Queen Anne, a modest 3-bedroom I'd bought in 1992 for $200,000 that was now worth $1.4 million, according to the latest assessment. But I'd never seen the point in upgrading to something ostentatious. The house was paid off, maintained well, filled with furniture I'd chosen carefully over decades rather than bought in a single designer splurge, and it suited my needs perfectly despite what Christine apparently thought about its lack of luxury. I'd built Summit Marketing Solutions from my dining room table when David was 10 years old. A single mother who'd been widowed at 35 and needed income more reliable than the life insurance payout that wouldn't last forever. The company had grown slowly but steadily, surviving the dot-com crash and the 2008 recession through careful management and genuine skill rather than venture capital and luck. By 2015, we'd employed 170 people and billed $14 million annually. Now we were at 240 employees, $23 million in annual billing, and I'd been gradually preparing to sell the company and actually retire. But that process required discretion and careful timing that Christine's explosion tonight had potentially complicated. My phone rang as I pulled into the garage, David calling, as expected, and I declined the call because this conversation needed to happen in person where he couldn't hang up when he heard things he didn't like. David appeared at my door at 8:47 p.m., looking like he'd driven directly from his office in Redmond without even going home first. His tie loosened, and his expression caught between anger and confusion in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. "Mom, what the hell happened? Christine is hysterical. She said you humiliated her at dinner and then fired her from Summit, which doesn't even make sense because you're retired, you don't work at Summit anymore, right? Please tell me this is some misunderstanding." I let him inside, made tea neither of us wanted, and sat him down in the living room where we'd had so many important conversations over 37 years. "I'm not retired," I said, starting with the simplest correction. "I own Summit Marketing Solutions. I founded it in 1989, built it to 240 employees and $23 million in annual billing, and I've been working reduced hours from home for the past 3 years after the stroke, but I'm absolutely still the owner and CEO." David's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, then a dawning horror that suggested he was starting to understand how badly this evening had gone. "You founded, but Christine works at Summit. She's been there for 4 years. Are you telling me she's been working for you this entire time and didn't know?" I confirmed that yes, Christine had been hired through normal HR processes, had never met me because I wasn't regularly in the office, and had apparently assumed I was a retired secretary living on limited means based on my modest lifestyle choices. Tonight at dinner, she spent 2 hours complaining about money troubles and how I never help you financially. Then when the bill came for $347, she stood up in a restaurant full of people and yelled, "Pay the bill, you broke old woman," loud enough that everyone heard. So I called Richard Chen, asked him to look up employee 4782's salary, and fired her in front of the same audience she'd chosen for my humiliation. The silence after my explanation stretched long enough that I could hear the wall clock ticking, could see David processing information that was apparently reconfiguring his understanding of his mother, his wife, and the dynamics that had been operating under his oblivious nose for 4 years. "You make $23 million annually," he finally said, his voice oddly flat. "You own a company worth what? 8 million? 10 million? And you never told me? You let me think you were struggling. Let Christine and me buy you gift cards for groceries at Christmas. Let us worry about whether you could afford your property taxes." The hurt in his voice was legitimate, and I felt the guilt that came with realizing my discretion about my finances had created its own kind of deception. "I never asked for gift cards or financial help," I said carefully. "You assumed I needed them based on my lifestyle, which is modest by choice, not necessity. I didn't correct those assumptions because I wanted to see how you and Christine treated me when you thought I had nothing to offer you except myself. Clearly, that was a revealing experiment. David flinched at that, understanding the implicit criticism, that Christine had treated me poorly specifically because she thought I was broke and therefore not worth respecting. She's not a bad person, Mom. She's stressed about money. We're stretched thin with the mortgage, and maybe she took that stress out on you unfairly. But firing her, that's her entire income. We can't afford the house on just my salary. I let him hear how that sounded, how he was asking me to prioritize his mortgage over my dignity, to let Christine's public humiliation slide, because firing her would create financial consequences for him. She called me a broke old woman in front of 60 people, David. She spent 4 years working for my company while treating me like I was irrelevant and poor. Those aren't forgivable mistakes. Those are character revelations, and I'm not reversing the termination. The argument with David lasted another 40 minutes, cycling through his attempts to defend Christine's behavior, my refusals to accept those defenses, and eventually his angry departure after I made clear that the termination was final and he needed to decide whether he'd address his wife's behavior or continue enabling it. After he left, I sat in my quiet living room, feeling the exhaustion that came with conflict, particularly conflict with my only child, and wondered if I'd been wrong to keep my financial success so private. The discretion had seemed wise for decades, didn't invite people who wanted money, didn't change how people treated me, let me live normally without the complications that wealth created. But tonight had revealed the cost of that discretion, the way it had allowed Christine to develop contempt for me based on faulty assumptions, the way David had apparently been influenced by her dismissive attitude because he'd never thought to question why his mother, who'd raised him alone and put him through college, might actually have resources beyond Social Security. My phone showed 3 missed calls from David and 2 texts from Christine's number that I deleted without reading, and I turned off notifications before heading to bed, because whatever they wanted to say could wait until I'd processed my own feelings about having been publicly humiliated by family. The last thought before sleep was that tomorrow I'd need to call Richard and make sure the termination paperwork was airtight, that Christine couldn't claim wrongful termination or age discrimination or any of the creative legal theories that fired employees sometimes deployed. My public humiliation would not be reversed by her legal redemption. The morning brought 17 text messages, 4 voicemails, and an email from Christine's personal account with the subject line, "I'm so sorry, please can we talk," that I archived without opening because apologies that came after consequences weren't nearly as valuable as behavior that prevented consequences in the first place. Richard called at 8:15 a.m. with confirmation that Christine's termination paperwork had been processed. Her laptop and badge access had been deactivated overnight, and security had been notified that she should not be admitted to the building when she arrived to return her equipment. She sent an email to HR at 6:42 this morning requesting an appeal of the termination decision, Richard said, his tone suggesting he found this about as credible as I did. Claimed it was a misunderstanding and that she wasn't aware of your role in the company. I responded that ignorance of corporate ownership doesn't excuse public insubordination and that the termination stands. She has until Friday to return all company property or will begin the process of billing her for replacement costs. I thanked Richard for handling it so efficiently and asked him to loop in our attorney to review everything for potential legal exposure because Christine seemed like someone who might convince David to fund a wrongful termination suit out of misplaced loyalty. The morning also brought a call from my sister Margaret, who'd somehow already heard about the incident. Apparently her friend's daughter had been at Marcello's last night and had witnessed the entire scene. "You fired David's wife?" Margaret said by way of greeting, her voice carrying equal parts shock and admiration. "At a restaurant? In front of people? Helen, this is the most dramatic thing you've done since you started a business in your dining room. Tell me everything." Margaret's visit that afternoon brought wine and sympathy and the kind of validation that comes from family who'd known you before you were successful and understood the full arc of your journey. "Christine always seemed a bit entitled to me," Margaret said, settled into my living room couch with her second glass of Pinot Grigio. The way she'd make comments about your house needing updating or your car being old, like she was constantly cataloging your supposed poverty. I asked you once why you didn't tell her about Summit, and you said you wanted to see who she really was, without money influencing it. Well, now you know. The observation was accurate but painful, confirming that my experiment in discretion had revealed Christine's character thoroughly and unflatteringly. We'd spent 4 years with her thinking I was broke, and in that time she'd developed a pattern of subtle disrespect, comments about my clothing being outdated, suggestions that I probably couldn't afford things, that careful condescension that people use when they think they're superior. I'd noticed it all, had documented it mentally, had told myself it might improve once she matured. But last night's explosion had proved that the disrespect wasn't immaturity, but genuine contempt. The kind that made someone comfortable, publicly humiliating an elderly woman they thought had no power to respond. David's furious with me, I told Margaret, refilling our wine glasses. Says I'm destroying his marriage over one mistake, that Christine was just stressed, and I'm overreacting by firing her. He doesn't seem to understand that you don't get to keep your job after you publicly humiliate your CEO, regardless of whether that CEO is your mother-in-law. Margaret nodded, having spent 30 years in corporate HR before retiring and understanding workplace dynamics better than most. The family relationship makes it more complicated, but doesn't change the fundamental issue. She was insubordinate in public. That's terminable. The fact that she didn't know you were the owner just means she was stupid in addition to cruel. The symbolic object that would eventually define this entire situation appeared on Thursday when Christine showed up at my door carrying her Summit marketing laptop in a canvas tote bag, her face blotchy from crying and her demeanor completely different from the aggressive confidence she'd displayed at Marcello's 3 nights ago. I need to return this, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. Security won't let me in the building and I don't want to be billed for it. Can you just take it and we can talk? I accepted the laptop, but didn't invite her inside, maintaining the boundary that she'd violated too thoroughly for casual forgiveness. There's nothing to discuss, Christine. You made your feelings about me clear on Tuesday. I responded appropriately as your employer. The termination is final. She shifted her weight, the tote bag now empty and hanging limp at her side, and I could see her working up to the apology she'd probably rehearsed. I didn't know you owned Summit. I swear I had no idea. If I'd known... I cut her off before she could finish that particular excuse. If you'd known I owned Summit, you'd have treated me differently? That's not the defense you think it is, Christine. It just confirms that you're only respectful to people you think have power over you. People with actual character treat everyone with respect, regardless of their perceived status or wealth. The distinction seemed to land, her face crumpling slightly as she realized her defense had actually made things worse. I'm sorry I called you broke. I'm sorry I yelled at you in the restaurant. I was stressed about money, and I took it out on you unfairly. Please, can't you just give me another chance? David and I need my income. We'll lose the house. The appeal to David's financial situation was strategic but ineffective because I'd raised David to handle his own finances and wasn't responsible for rescuing him from a mortgage he'd chosen or a wife he'd married. The conversation with Christine on my doorstep lasted another 10 minutes of her cycling through apologies, explanations, and eventually tears, none of which changed my position that the termination was appropriate and final. You spent 4 years treating me like I was irrelevant because you thought I was poor, I said when she'd finally run out of arguments. Every dismissive comment, every time you made me feel small, every suggestion that I was too old or too broke to understand your life, that was who you really are when you think there are no consequences. Tuesday night, you just made the mistake of being that person in front of witnesses and to someone who actually could enforce consequences. I'm not reversing the termination, Christine. You need to accept that and figure out your finances accordingly. She left still crying, and I watched her drive away feeling a complicated mix of satisfaction and guilt that came from having protected my own dignity at the cost of my son's marriage stability. The laptop sat on my hallway table in its canvas tote, a physical reminder of Christine's employment and the revelation that had ended it, and I'd eventually return it to Richard with a note about the retrieval. But for now, it stayed on the table, evidence that actions had consequences, even when those actions were directed at people you'd underestimated. The symbolic weight of that laptop, the career it represented, the income it had provided, the false security Christine had felt before discovering her broke old mother-in-law was actually her CEO, would become important later. But in that moment, it was just a company asset returned by a terminated employee who'd made the mistake of confusing discretion with weakness. David stopped speaking to me entirely after Christine's doorstep visit, his silence communicating anger more effectively than his earlier arguments had, and I settled into the uncomfortable reality that protecting my dignity had cost me my relationship with my only child, at least temporarily. Work continued normally. Richard handled the day-to-day operations, while I managed strategy and major decisions from home. The arrangement we'd maintained since my stroke made regular office presence inadvisable. Summit's clients never noticed any disruption from Christine's departure. Her duties were redistributed to other team members within 48 hours, and within a week, her employment seemed like a minor historical footnote rather than the company crisis David had predicted. But the family crisis was real and ongoing, marked by David's continued silence and Margaret's reports that he and Christine were fighting constantly about money now that they'd lost 30% of their household income. "He's angry with you, but he's angrier with her," Margaret reported after running into David at the grocery store. Apparently, once he started actually thinking about how she'd treated you over 4 years, he realized it was a pattern he'd been ignoring because it was easier than confronting her. The restaurant incident just made it impossible to ignore anymore. The analysis gave me some hope that David's anger might eventually include appropriate distribution of blame. But it didn't solve the immediate problem that my son wasn't speaking to me, and Christmas was approaching with no clear path to reconciliation. The thought of spending holidays alone because I'd fired my daughter-in-law was depressing in ways I hadn't anticipated when I'd made that decision at Marcello's. Thanksgiving arrived with an invitation from Margaret to join her family's dinner, and I accepted because the alternative was staying home alone, dwelling on family dysfunction and consequences. Margaret's house was warm and loud with her 3 children and their families, and I played the role of favorite aunt with practiced ease while internally missing David and wishing things had resolved differently. My phone stayed silent all day. No call from David, no text acknowledging the holiday, just emptiness where our relationship used to be. Margaret noticed my checking my phone repeatedly and squeezed my shoulder in sympathy, but didn't offer platitudes about everything working out, because she understood that sometimes consequences lasted longer than comfort allowed. The evening brought an unexpected development when my phone finally did ring at 8:27 p.m., but the caller was Christine, not David, her voice shaky but more composed than during our doorstep conversation weeks ago. "I'm calling without David knowing," she said. "He'd be furious if he knew I was talking to you. But I needed to say something that I didn't say before. You were right." The admission surprised me into silence, and she continued into that silence. "You were right that I treated you badly because I thought you were broke. I was disrespectful and dismissive, and I made you feel small because it made me feel bigger. That's not someone I want to be, and losing my job has given me a lot of time to think about who I actually am versus who I pretend to be. I'm not asking for my job back. I know that's done. But I needed you to know that I understand now why you fired me, and you were right to do it." Christine's call lasted 17 minutes, long enough for her to explain that she'd started therapy to address what she called her status anxiety, and that she and David were selling the house they couldn't afford to buy something more reasonable, and that she'd gotten a new job at a smaller firm for $62,000, which was a pay cut, but also a humbling experience she'd apparently needed. "David's still really angry with you," she said near the end of the call. "But I think he's starting to understand that this wasn't about you being cruel. It was about me being who I actually am and finally facing consequences for it. He's just not ready to admit that yet, because it means admitting he married someone who'd treat his mother that way." The insight was more self-aware than I'd given Christine credit for, and when we disconnected, I felt marginally better about the situation, even though nothing material had changed. David still wasn't speaking to me, I'd still fired my daughter-in-law, and Thanksgiving had still been spent away from my son. But Christine's apology had been genuine in a way her doorstep tears hadn't been, carrying actual understanding rather than just regret about consequences. And that felt like progress, even if it was progress toward a relationship that might never fully heal. Margaret found me on her back porch after the call, looking at the lights on the houses below, and I told her about Christine's apology. "Does this mean you'd hire her back?" Margaret asked, and I shook my head immediately. "No. The apology is nice, but it doesn't change what happened or prove that her behavior would be different with power dynamics reversed. She's sorry, and that matters, but sorry doesn't erase what she revealed about herself." Margaret nodded, acceptance of that logic, and we stood together in companionable silence, watching the neighborhood lights and processing family complications that didn't have neat resolutions. December brought the unexpected complication of Christine's new employer reaching out to Richard about a reference check, apparently having discovered she'd previously worked at Summit and wanting verification of her employment and departure circumstances. "What do you want me to tell them?" Richard asked during our Monday morning strategic call. The truth about her termination could torpedo her chances at this new job, but lying would expose us to liability if she turns out to be problematic and they sue us for misrepresentation. The ethical dilemma was real. I could destroy Christine's new opportunity by having Richard explain she'd been fired for public insubordination. Or I could authorize a neutral reference that confirmed employment dates and left out the circumstances of termination. Tell them she was employed from August 2019 until November 2023 in the marketing coordinator role. And that company policy is to confirm employment only without commenting on performance or departure circumstances, I said after considering the options. She apologized genuinely, and she's trying to rebuild. I'm not going to sabotage that, even though she sabotaged herself with her behavior. Richard confirmed he'd handle the reference that way, and I felt satisfied that I'd chosen the ethical high ground, even though it meant letting Christine move forward without the full consequences her actions might have warranted. Protecting her new job didn't mean forgiving what she'd done, didn't mean we'd suddenly have family dinners together, but it did mean I wasn't going to be vindictive beyond the boundaries of appropriate workplace consequences. She'd been fired for legitimate reasons. She'd lost income and learned hard lessons, and that was sufficient justice without destroying her ability to earn elsewhere. Christmas Eve brought the breakthrough I'd stopped hoping for when David appeared at my door at 6 p.m. carrying a bottle of wine and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else but had forced himself to come anyway. "Can we talk?" he asked, and I let him inside to the living room where we'd had so many difficult conversations over the years, each one marking some transition or crisis or moment requiring honesty. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," David started, sitting on the couch but perched on the edge like he might flee at any moment. "About Christine yelling at you in the restaurant, about you firing her, about what that whole situation revealed about my marriage and my wife, and honestly about me." He paused, gathering words that clearly weren't easy. "Christine was wrong. Completely, unforgivably wrong to treat you that way, and even more wrong to do it publicly. I was wrong to defend her behavior and ask you to overlook it because her consequences were inconvenient for me. And I think I was wrong to never question why my mom, who put me through college and helped with my first house down payment, was supposedly struggling financially. I let Christine's narrative about you being broke shape my perception instead of actually paying attention to the evidence that you were fine." The apology was specific and thoughtful in ways that suggested he'd actually processed the situation rather than just deciding to reconcile. And I felt tension I'd been carrying for 7 weeks start to release slightly. "I'm proud of you for building Summit," David continued. "I'm ashamed I didn't know about it, didn't ask the right questions to discover it, and let my wife disrespect you for years without recognizing the pattern. You were right to fire her. As her employer, as the CEO she publicly disrespected, you made the only reasonable decision." The conversation with David lasted through the bottle of wine he'd brought and into a second bottle I retrieved from my modest wine collection, covering everything from his marriage troubles to his new understanding of my financial situation to his processing of the fact that I'd let him and Christine struggle financially when I could have helped easily. "Why didn't you just tell us you owned Summit?" he asked at one point. "Why let us think you needed grocery gift cards and worry about your property taxes?" The question deserved an honest answer. "Because people treat you differently when they know you're wealthy," I said. "They want things. They have expectations. They measure every interaction against what you could provide them. I wanted to be treated like a person, like a mother, not like a resource. Christine's behavior over 4 years proved exactly why that discretion was wise. She treated me terribly when she thought I was broke, and I guarantee she'd have treated me differently if she'd known I owned an $8 million company. That differential treatment based purely on money tells you everything about someone's character. David absorbed this quietly, then asked the question I'd been waiting for. Are you going to help Christine and me financially now that I know about Summit? I appreciated that he'd asked directly rather than dancing around it. No, I said, equally direct. You're 37 years old, capable, employed at a good company making good money. The fact that you overextended on a house you couldn't afford isn't my emergency to solve. Struggle builds character. You and Christine are learning to live within your means, and that's a valuable lesson that my money would erase. He nodded slowly, disappointed but not argumentative. That's fair, he said, and honestly, probably what I needed to hear. The reconciliation with David that Christmas Eve didn't mean everything was resolved or that our relationship returned to its previous state, but it meant we were communicating again and building towards something more honest than what we'd had before. He left around 10 p.m. with plans to return the next day for Christmas dinner that would be just the two of us. Christine was spending the holiday with her parents, navigating her own family's disappointment about her job loss and their financial downsizing. I'm not saying everything with Christine is resolved, David said at the door, pulling on his coat. We're in counseling, trying to address the patterns that led to her treating you that way and me enabling it. I don't know if the marriage will survive that much honesty, but either way, I needed to fix things with you first, because you were right and I was wrong, and I'm sorry it took me almost 2 months to admit that. After he left, I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the modest furniture and simple decorations that Christine had once dismissed as evidence of poverty, and I felt something like peace settling over the situation. I'd been publicly humiliated, I'd fired my daughter-in-law, I'd lost 2 months with my son, but I'd also maintained my dignity, enforced appropriate consequences, and ultimately been proven right about the importance of being treated with respect, regardless of perceived wealth or status. The laptop Christine had returned weeks ago still sat in my hallway, waiting to be returned to IT, and I picked it up feeling its weight. The physical manifestation of a career ended and a lesson learned. Tomorrow I'd return it to Richard with instructions for proper disposal. Tonight it was just a reminder that actions had consequences, and that sometimes protecting yourself meant accepting complicated outcomes. The aftermath of what became known among my small circle as the Marcello's incident continued to unfold through January and into the new year, with ripples affecting not just my relationship with David and Christine, but also my thinking about Summit's future and my own retirement timeline. The plan had been to sell Summit within 18 months, to find a buyer who'd maintain the culture and retain the staff while giving me the exit that would fund the next phase of my life. But Christine's termination and the family drama it created had introduced complications. Any buyer doing due diligence would discover the recent termination of the founder's daughter-in-law, would ask questions about the circumstances, might worry about ongoing family entanglements affecting the business. We can disclose it proactively and frame it as professional boundary enforcement, Richard suggested during our January strategy meeting. Frame you as someone who maintains appropriate standards, even when it's personally costly. That could actually be appealing to buyers who worry about family drama infecting business operations. The reframing made sense, turning my firing of Christine from a liability into evidence of professional judgment, but it still meant addressing it rather than pretending it hadn't happened. The other complication was that firing Christine had reminded me I was still capable of running the company, still engaged enough to make difficult personnel decisions, still sharp enough to recognize insubordination and enforce consequences. Maybe I didn't need to sell as urgently as I'd thought. Maybe another 2 years building value wouldn't hurt. The decision didn't need to be made immediately, but the Marcello's incident had definitely changed my timeline in ways I was still processing. February brought an unexpected development when Christine requested a meeting through Margaret rather than calling directly, apparently having learned that direct contact wasn't welcome but indirect requests through my sister might be considered. She wants to apologize in person, Margaret relayed during our weekly lunch. Says she's been in therapy for 3 months and her therapist thinks it would be helpful for closure. I told her I'd ask, but that you weren't obligated to agree. The request surprised me. Christine had already apologized by phone on Thanksgiving, and I'd assumed that was the extent of the closure we'd achieve. But something about the formality of asking through Margaret, the acknowledgement that she needed permission to access my time and space, suggested this might be different from her tearful doorstep plea in November. "Tell her I'll meet her for coffee," I said, making a decision that felt risky but potentially necessary. "Somewhere public next Tuesday at 2 p.m., 30 minutes maximum. If she's late, I'm leaving." Margaret conveyed the terms and Christine accepted immediately, and the following Tuesday I found myself back at a different Italian restaurant, not Marcello's, I'd never return there, waiting for my former daughter-in-law to arrive for our supervised reconciliation attempt. She appeared at 1:58 p.m., early enough to prove commitment, but not so early as to seem desperate, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked nothing like the designer dress she'd worn to our disastrous dinner 3 months ago. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sitting across from me in the booth I'd chosen for privacy. "I know you didn't have to agree to this." The conversation that followed was different from any previous interaction Christine and I had shared, marked by her willingness to sit in uncomfortable honesty rather than deflecting or defending. "My therapist helped me understand that how I treated you came from my own insecurity about money," Christine explained, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. "I grew up really poor, like food stamps and eviction notices poor, and I spent my entire adult life trying to distance myself from that. When I met David and thought you were struggling financially, it triggered something in me where I needed to establish that I'd risen above that I was successful and you were the one who hadn't managed money well. It's cruel and it's classist, and it's exactly the kind of judgment I hated when people made it about my family. But I did it to you because it made me feel safer somehow." The self-awareness was striking, and I found myself actually listening rather than waiting for her to finish so I could leave. "The restaurant incident wasn't about the bill," she continued. "It was about me needing to perform superiority in front of witnesses, needing other people to see that I was the one with power and resources, and you were the one who needed help. When you turned out to be the CEO of the company where I worked, where I'd been performing competence for 4 years, it destroyed that entire narrative I'd built. I wasn't the successful one who'd escaped poverty. I was the employee who'd been so stupid she didn't recognize her own boss." Christine's voice cracked slightly. "I deserved to be fired. I deserved the financial consequences. What I'm asking for isn't my job back or for you to help David and me financially. I'm asking if we can eventually have a relationship that isn't defined by what I did. If someday you might be able to see me as someone who learned from profound mistakes, rather than just as the person who called you a broke old woman in public." The request was reasonable, but not something I could grant immediately, not after 3 months of processing and not with David's marriage still unstable from the revelations my firing of Christine had triggered. "I appreciate the apology and the self-awareness you're showing," I told Christine carefully. "But rebuilding trust after what you did isn't going to be quick or easy. You didn't just disrespect me once. You spent 4 years making dismissive comments about my house, my car, my lifestyle. All the small ways you communicated that you thought I was lesser because you thought I was poor. That pattern of behavior revealed something about your character that an apology doesn't automatically fix." Christine nodded, accepting the assessment without argument. "I understand. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness or for us to suddenly be close. I'm just asking for the possibility that someday we might have a relationship that isn't entirely defined by my worst moment. David and I are staying together. We're working through the things my behavior revealed about our relationship. And if we have kids someday, I don't want them to grow up with a grandmother who can't be in the same room with their mother." The mention of potential grandchildren was strategic but effective, hitting the one argument that might actually move me toward forgiveness faster than I'd otherwise travel. "Give me time," I said. "Keep working on yourself in therapy. Keep treating David better. And maybe in another 6 months or a year we can try having dinner again, somewhere other than Marcello's, and see if we can build something different." Christine accepted this with visible relief, and we finished our coffee talking carefully about neutral topics: her new job, David's recent promotion, Margaret's upcoming cruise, before parting with a handshake that felt more promising than I'd expected 30 minutes earlier. The spring and summer passed with gradual warming in my relationship with Christine, mediated primarily through family gatherings at Margaret's house, where we were never alone but could practice being civil to each other in controlled environments. David reported that their marriage counseling was helping, that they'd sold the Bellevue house and bought something smaller in Renton that they could actually afford on their combined incomes, that Christine had been promoted at her new firm to senior marketing coordinator with a salary of $74,000. She's different now, David told me during one of our regular dinners that had resumed in March. More aware of how she treats people, less concerned about appearing successful versus actually being content. The whole experience of being fired and having to face what she'd done was humbling in ways she apparently needed. I was glad Christine was growing, but remained cautious about fully trusting that the growth was permanent rather than performative, knowing that people often changed under consequences, but reverted once consequences lifted. The real test would come when their finances stabilized and the immediate crisis passed. Would Christine maintain her newfound humility or slip back into the status anxiety that had driven her behavior before? Time would tell, and I was willing to wait and observe rather than rushing into reconciliation that might be premature. Summit continued operating successfully under Richard's day-to-day management, and I'd made the decision to delay selling for at least another 2 years, finding that I enjoyed the strategic work and wasn't ready to fully retire into irrelevance. The Marcello's incident had reminded me that I was still sharp, still capable of making difficult decisions, still someone with authority and impact rather than just an old woman people could dismiss. The 1-year anniversary of the Marcello's incident arrived in November with an invitation to dinner from Christine and David at their new house in Renton. A small 3-bedroom that was a dramatic downgrade from the showcase property they'd been struggling to afford, but that felt warmer and more genuinely theirs. "We wanted to mark the anniversary by showing you we're different now," Christine explained when I arrived, her nervousness visible but managed. Different people in a different house with different priorities. And to say thank you for giving me the push I needed to become someone I'm actually proud of being. The dinner was simple: homemade pasta and salad, wine from Trader Joe's rather than the expensive bottles Christine used to insist on. And the conversation was easier than I'd expected, flowing naturally between work stories and family updates without the undercurrent of tension that had marked every previous interaction. "I got promoted again," Christine shared halfway through dinner. "Marketing director, $89,000, which is actually more than I was making at Summit when you fired me. My boss said I'm the hardest worker on the team, that I treat everyone with respect regardless of their role, and that she values the humility I bring to leadership. She has no idea that the humility came from being fired by my mother-in-law for calling her a broke old woman in public." The self-deprecating humor was new, suggesting Christine had actually integrated the lesson rather than just performing regret, and I found myself laughing genuinely at the image of her new boss's oblivious compliment. "The funny thing is that I'm happier now than I was before," Christine continued. "When David and I were drowning in mortgage payments, and I was trying to keep up appearances and treating you badly to make myself feel successful, I was miserable. Now we live in a smaller house and make less money combined than we did before, but I actually like who I am. Turns out being fired was the best thing that could have happened to me." The evening ended with Christine walking me to my car and saying something she'd clearly rehearsed but delivered with genuine emotion. "I know I already apologized, and we've been working on rebuilding for months, but I wanted to say specifically, you were right to fire me. Not just right as my employer enforcing standards, but right as my mother-in-law refusing to accept disrespect. I'm teaching myself to have the boundaries you modeled that night at Marcello's, to be someone who doesn't tolerate being treated poorly even when enforcement is costly. You lost 2 months with David because you fired me. That must have been terrible. But you showed me that dignity matters more than avoiding conflict, and that's something I'm trying to model in my own life now. So thank you." The gratitude was unexpected and surprisingly moving, reframing my decision to fire Christine from a moment of justified anger into an act of teaching that had apparently resonated beyond my intention. "You're welcome," I said, meaning it. "And for what it's worth, I'm glad you learned something from it instead of just resenting me forever. That makes the 2 months of David not speaking to me feel more worthwhile." We hugged awkwardly, still rebuilding physical comfort with each other, and I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected to feel about Christine. Hope. Hope that people could actually change, that consequences could teach rather than just punish, that family relationships could survive profound ruptures if everyone involved was willing to do the work. The Marcello's incident would always be part of our history, the story that came up at family gatherings with a mix of humor and horror. But maybe it didn't have to define us forever. Maybe we could build something better from the ruins of what had been revealed that night when Christine called me a broke old woman and I'd responded by firing her in front of 60 witnesses. The decision about Summit's future finally crystallized in December, almost 14 months after the Marcello's incident, when a potential buyer made an unsolicited offer that was substantial enough to be taken seriously. Richard brought me the preliminary numbers, $12.4 million for the company, structured as $8 million at closing and $4.4 million in earn-out over 3 years based on performance metrics. "It's a strong offer," Richard said during our meeting to discuss it. "Above our target valuation, from a buyer with a good reputation for maintaining company culture, and structured in a way that keeps me and the key team in place. If you're ready to sell, this is probably the opportunity." I reviewed the offer packet carefully, noting that the buyer had done thorough due diligence, including discovering Christine's termination and apparently determining it demonstrated appropriate professional standards rather than family dysfunction. "They actually cited your firing of employee 4782 as evidence of ethical leadership," Richard pointed out with visible amusement. "Said it showed you maintain boundaries even when personally costly and that you don't let family relationships compromise business judgment. Christine's termination became a selling point rather than a liability. The irony was delicious. Being publicly humiliated by my daughter-in-law and firing her in response had apparently made me more attractive to buyers rather than less. "I'm ready to sell," I told Richard after reviewing everything twice. "Let's negotiate the earn-out terms and finalize the deal. It's time for me to actually retire." The decision felt right in ways that hadn't been true a year ago, when I'd still been processing anger and proving I was still sharp enough to run things. Now I was ready to pass Summit to someone else and move into the next phase, where I was just David's mother, and eventually Christine's mother-in-law, and someday hopefully a grandmother who'd already resolved family drama before grandchildren arrived. The sale of Summit Marketing Solutions closed in March, exactly 16 months after the Marcello's incident and 4 months after reconnecting meaningfully with Christine. Bringing $8 million immediately and the promise of another $4.4 million if performance targets were met. I spent a week feeling disoriented without the work that had defined me for 34 years. And then I adjusted to retirement with the same practical efficiency I'd brought to everything else. Establishing routines, finding projects, discovering that life without work stress was actually pleasant once you stopped defining yourself entirely through professional achievement. David and Christine's marriage continued to strengthen, marked by their announcement in April that they were expecting a baby in December, news that Christine delivered nervously, like she was worried I might resent becoming a grandmother, given our history. "I'm delighted," I assured her honestly, "and grateful we worked through our issues before this baby arrives, so they'll grow up with a grandmother who's present rather than estranged." The pregnancy seemed to cement Christine's transformation, giving her something to focus on beyond career status and financial anxiety, and I watched her approach impending motherhood with a humility and groundedness that the earlier Christine would never have demonstrated. "I keep thinking about how I treated you when I thought you were broke," she told me during one of our monthly lunches that had become routine. "And I'm terrified I'll raise a kid who measures people by their money the way I did. How do I prevent that?" The question gave me the opportunity to share my own parenting philosophy, the same one that had led me to keep my wealth private and let Christine reveal her character before knowing I had resources to share. "You teach them to respect people based on their character rather than their circumstances," I said. "And you model that respect yourself consistently, not just when you think you're being watched." The baby arrived 2 weeks early on December 14th, a healthy girl they named Helen Margaret, after me and my sister, a naming choice that made me cry when David called from the hospital to share the news. Christine insisted on Helen as the first name, David told me, his voice carrying the exhaustion and joy of new fatherhood. She said she wanted our daughter to have a name that would remind her every day to treat people with respect and maintain boundaries and not judge people by their bank accounts. Pretty heavy expectation for a 7-pound infant, but Christine's committed to it. I visited the hospital that evening and held my granddaughter for the first time, looking at her tiny, perfect face and feeling the weight of being someone's namesake, someone whose story would be told to this child as she grew. What would they tell her about the incident at Marcello's? About her mother calling me a broke old woman and me firing her in response? Would it be a cautionary tale about pride and assumptions? Or a funny family story about the grandmother who owned a company nobody knew about? Or just an embarrassing historical incident everyone wanted to forget? Probably all three, depending on who was telling it and when. But looking at baby Helen's face, I hoped they'd tell her the full story. Not to shame Christine, but to teach little Helen that actions have consequences, that treating people poorly based on perceived status is wrong, and that sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to have more power than you imagined. Those were lessons worth passing down, even if they came wrapped in family dysfunction and public humiliation. Christine appeared in the doorway of the hospital room, still exhausted from delivery but smiling at the sight of me holding her daughter. And I saw in her face the person she'd become rather than the person she'd been. Someone genuinely grateful for second chances and committed to not needing third ones. The epilogue to the Marcello's incident unfolded over the following year as I settled into retirement and grandmotherhood with equal enthusiasm, splitting my time between travel that my summit sale had funded and babysitting that gave David and Christine the support new parents desperately needed. Little Helen was 6 months old when Christine finally asked the question I'd been waiting for since her birth. "Do you regret firing me?" Looking back, knowing we'd end up here with you holding our daughter and us having a good relationship, would you make a different choice? The question deserved an honest answer. "No," I said, watching baby Helen grab at my necklace with the determined focus of someone discovering object permanence. "Because we're here, at this good place with honest relationship, specifically because I fired you, not despite it. If I'd let you treat me that way without consequences, you'd have learned that public humiliation works, that you could get away with disrespect because family obligation meant I had to accept it. The firing was the consequence that forced you to examine your behavior and change it. So no, I don't regret it. It was painful, and it cost me 2 months with David, and it complicated my company sale. But it also led to genuine transformation rather than surface reconciliation. That's worth the cost." Christine absorbed this thoughtfully, then said something I hadn't expected. "I'm going to tell Helen the story when she's old enough to understand it. Not as a, here's why grandma is terrible story, but as a, here's what happens when you judge people wrongly, and here's why consequences matter story. I want her to learn from my mistakes without having to make them herself." The commitment to using her own failure as teaching material was perhaps the clearest evidence that Christine had actually changed, that she'd integrated the lesson thoroughly enough to volunteer it as cautionary tale for the next generation. "That's brave," I told her, "and I think it's wise. Just make sure you tell it in a way that shows growth rather than just shame." We sat together in comfortable silence after that, 3 generations of women connected by name and blood and complicated history. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, from the Marcello's Italian restaurant, through Christine's termination and our eventual reconciliation, thank you for witnessing a story about dignity and consequences and the possibility of genuine change when people are willing to do the work. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about family conflicts that required hard boundaries and unexpected resolutions. About people who underestimated others based on appearances and learned expensive lessons. About the specific way that defending yourself can sometimes cost relationships temporarily, but preserve integrity permanently. Comment below with your city or state if you've ever had to enforce consequences with family, even though it was costly. Because those decisions are some of the hardest we make, and there's value in knowing others have navigated similar choices. My daughter-in-law screamed at me in a restaurant full of people, calling me a broke old woman who needed to pay her bill. I responded by calling my company accountant, asking about employee 4782's salary, and firing her in front of the same witnesses she'd chosen for my humiliation. The decision cost me 2 months with my son, complicated my company sale, and required me to maintain boundaries even when they hurt. But it also taught Christine lessons she needed to learn, showed David that I had resources and dignity worth respecting, and ultimately led to honest relationships built on mutual respect rather than false assumptions. The Black American Express card that paid the bill at Marcello's that night is still in my wallet, a reminder that appearances can deceive and that quiet discretion sometimes serves you better than obvious wealth. Christine kept the canvas tote bag she'd used to return her company laptop, using it now for baby supplies and calling it her humility bag, with self-deprecating humor that proves growth is possible. And somewhere in Summit Marketing Solutions' archived files is Employee 4782's termination paperwork, documentation that consequences matter and that even family relationships have boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. The story doesn't have a perfect ending because real life rarely does, but it has an honest one where everyone involved learned something about themselves and chose growth over resentment. That's the best any of us can hope for when conflict reveals uncomfortable truths about the people we love.